Welcome to God We Trusted. I'm your host, Will. I'm here alongside Sam. Sam, what are we talking about today?
Today, we're going to be talking about communism and how this has been an idea that for the last century and a half or so has really appealed to people, and everybody comes to it and they're like, oh, that sounds really great. But in practice, every single time that it's tried, it has been atrocious. It's a blight on humanity. It causes unbelievable suffering and death everywhere it's tried. And so we want to talk about it just to kind of teach, and from a biblical perspective, why this is such a bad idea.
Yeah, it's one of those theories that should have died when every time it happens, it's awful. But all of a sudden, every college course is like, hey, what about this? And all the young people are like, maybe.
Yeah, and I mean, you can understand how this appeals to like a working class people. You know, for example, today we live in a generation where younger people are coming up, housing seems unaffordable. People are looking at life and they're like, man, a 40-hour work week and you just slave away for a company and, you know, you have no life of your own and you feel the oppression of having to go to work and make a living in a world that feels set up against you. And so you can imagine a revolutionary who comes along and says, you know what, let's just get rid of all that. Yeah. You know, communism will take all the money from the wealthy and we'll distribute it around and nobody will own anything anymore. There will be no more businesses to oppress you. The oligarchs will wipe them out. Everybody will just share and it'll be wonderful and everybody will have enough food and everybody will, you know, participate in the success of the country. And everybody's like, yeah, that sounds really, really good. Until it's in practice and you find out that communism does not take the poor and lift them up. It takes everybody and tears them down.
So where did communism really start? Where did it come from? Who came up with this idea?
So Karl Marx, who wrote the Communist Manifesto in 1848, is the first guy who comes along, and he is hitting at all of these kinds of sentiments, right? So in the 1800s, you've got the Industrial Revolution, you've got labor laws and all that stuff that start coming out. And Marx is coming in Europe. He's in Germany. And he's like, the working class is being treated like garbage. Let's start a revolution. We'll build them up and we'll take over. And he had this idea of communism, which he defines as the abolition of private property, which means you don't have your money. He doesn't have his money. She doesn't have her money. No private businesses. Everything is owned together, right? And he's like, that'll work great. We'll have a temporary period where, you know, the government has to, of course, take from everybody to distribute it out and make sure that everything's okay. And that's, of course, that's going to be pretty oppressive and it's going to be a revolution that's violent. And he owned all that. But he said the abolition of private property is therefore the complete emancipation of all human senses and qualities. You're no longer going to be enslaved to materialism. We'll be able to have a brotherhood where we just exist together and work in harmony. And like you hear that and you're like, man, that sounds okay. And so what Marx, except for the bloodshed and all of that part, but he says, you know, the government will take over. The government will educate the children collectively. The government will be the one that drives everything. And Marx, who is not a believer, in fact, he says communism begins where atheism begins. He recognized you have to get rid of religion for communism to work, which makes sense why.
Because God gives us all individual value and freedom, and that communism just takes it away.
That's right. Religion, and especially the Bible, comes along and it gives you property rights and it gives you the Imago Dei, and it says that God is the highest authority and that you owe your allegiance to him. Well, for communism to work, guess who has to be the highest authority?
The government.
The state. And so anytime you see a dictator, one of the first things they always do is to come in and try to wipe out religion. You see that in every single communist regime that's ever been tried. They come and they stamp out religion. And the reason for that is they can't have a competitor that's higher than the government's authority. And then before you know it, in every single communist experiment that's tried, they say, you know what, this is going to be great. We're going to tear down from the people who are the oppressors, right? So communism comes and says, oh, there's a victim and a villain class. There's those people who are trying to hold from you. And then there's this underclass that's being exploited. And the exploited need to overthrow the oppressors. And it's like after that, everything will just be rosy and wonderful.
Yeah.
You know, it's the same sentiment that drove the French Revolution that ended in crazy bloodshed and political instability. Well, every time that kind of thing is tried, the same thing happens again and again. And so in 1917, you find the first communist revolution in Russia, which is the Bolshevik Revolution, where they come in and you have Vladimir Lenin and his underlings, Joseph Stalin and others, and they're like, workers of the world, bring them together. What happens? Lenin goes on a Red Terror campaign where 6 million people die. His successor, Stalin, comes and kills 20 million people. And it's all with a utopian vision, right? That's so appealing. Like, we'll get rid of suffering. We'll get rid of all the slavery. We'll get rid of all the exploitation. And then they just become the ones who choose the winners and losers. And so when Stalin comes in and he's killing 20 million people and he's like, well, Ukraine has a lot of food over there. We'll just take from them. And then he starves the Ukraine, and millions of them die under his leadership. In the 40s, when China's like, oh, communism seems like a great idea. And you have Mao who comes along. Guess what the death toll is under Mao, bringing this utopian vision to the world?
I mean, dozens of millions, right?
Yeah, it's 60 million people die. And so and you go and you look at Pol Pot and Cambodia and all the places where communism is tried, Cuba, you see massive, massive suffering where whoever has the power drives everyone into the dirt. Anyone who stands against them, anyone who speaks up against suffering or exploitation or government abuses, they just disappear. They're gone. They go to the gulags. They're put in camps, or they're just straight up murdered. You find this in every single communist regime that's ever been tried. And here's the deal. Like, if you were to step back and you were to say, man, but doesn't the ethic of communism sound good? I mean, apart from the atheism thing, right?
Yeah.
Which they require atheism because they're trying to exploit power. But doesn't it sound good? Like, we're all going to share. A lot of people will try to say, oh, Christianity is pro-communism. Look at Acts 2. They shared everything in common. Well, in Acts 2, they're doing it voluntarily out of an ethic of love that's like, hey, if you have a need, I want to meet it.
Yeah, I'm going to fill it personally with my private choice.
That's right. I'm going to sell it, and I'm going to give from the heart, not because a gun's pointed at me, right? Well, what happens with communism is it comes with this ethic that says, hey, you can trust the benevolent government to institute this idea of sharing that's going to go across, class lines and bring everybody together. What's the problem with that? Communism runs under the assumption that humanity's good.
Yeah,
and can be trusted, and that when you give them power, that they will use it for good. And if there's anything that political history can show you over thousands of years, is what happens when you give humanity unchecked power.
Only bad.
They will abuse it. They will absolutely abuse it. Like, even when you go to the Bible, the most trusted figure, the man after God's own heart, right? Here's King David. What does he do? When he gets power, all of a sudden he becomes corrupted. He starts exploiting people. He puts Uriah to death. He takes advantage of Bathsheba. You look at Solomon and his writings, and when he becomes more and more powerful, he begins to exploit people to where when he leaves as king, when he dies, the people are like, oh, we feel so oppressed. Please give us rest. So like every single king, no matter, even if they're the righteous ones, every single king that gets power struggles with corrupting power. And the brilliance of where America comes from and the ideas of free markets. America wasn't started by saying, oh yeah, we're capitalism, just go run and do whatever you want to each other. It was founded under the idea that humanity is pretty corrupt.
Yeah.
Like, that's why we have separation of powers, because you don't want one person to have much power. And that's why we have checks and balances. And it's why we have term limits for people in office. And it's why we put boundaries around those that are in authority, because every time someone's given authority that's unchecked, they'll abuse it. And so with the system of a free market in a constitutional republic, there were boundaries set on it. And capitalism without moral restraint is just as gross. You will exploit other people. You'll drive them into the dirt. It's usually what creates the impulse to run toward communism, is to look at the exploited and to be like, hey, that's not fair. That's not good. But the instinct to then be like, so we need to take, this has always been a crazy thing to me. So the impulse of communism is, hey, look at how these exploited people are being abused by the powerful. We need to give more power to the powerful to help them. And it's like, what? Like, that's the absolute wrong instinct. It's going to result in more misery for the exploited. And it does every time. Communism is a fool's mission.
Yeah, the communist equation only works if there's no sin.
That's right.
Like when you look at the utopian vision, you're like, oh man, this would be awesome. But then when you look at our own hearts, it's like, man, you give me that kind of power, I don't know what I'm going to do. And that's the same with every human that takes regard in that. So you mentioned kind of the big two, Russia and China being communist parties, but like, are there more?
Yeah, I mean, you go back to 1917 and then the 1940s. That triggered the Red Scare. Like if you go back and study U.S. history, in the late 1940s, after World War II, 1950s, you have the Red Scare where the U.S. is looking at communism spreading all over the globe, which is this godless, oppressive scourge on humanity. And today we're like, oh, communism, no big deal. But communism nearly dominated the world, and it would have made the world a really dark place. But I want to let me read to you the number of nations that dabbled in communism and felt the misery of it. Ready? Afghanistan, Albania, Angola, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Belarus, Benin, Bosnia, Bulgaria, Burma, Cambodia, Cape Verde, Colombia, Congo, Croatia, Cuba, Czech Republic, Estonia. If you notice, I'm going in alphabetical order and we're on E. Ethiopia, Finland, Georgia, East Germany, Grenada, Greece, Guinea, Hungary, Kampuchea, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Laos, Latvia, Lithuania, Macedonia, Madagascar, Moldova, Mongolia, Montenegro, Mozambique, Nepal, Nicaragua, North Korea, North Vietnam, Peru, Poland, Romania, Slovenia, Somalia, South Vietnam, Spain, Sudan, Tajikistan, Tibet, Turkmenistan, Ukraine, Uzbekistan, Yemen, and Yugoslavia. So communism was
popular.
like, it was spreading and it was just swallowing up the earth. And you know what it left behind in the 20th century? A death toll that exceeds 100 million dead.
Wow.
Of regimes that killed their own people, of regimes that starved intentionally their own people, of regimes that outlawed religion everywhere that it was tried, imprisoning priests and ministers, outlawing the gospel, outlawing other religions as well. It was one of the most oppressive systems that's ever been tried. And the fact that this modern generation is like, seems like a good idea, is because our history classes are not teaching what communism actually imposed on the world. And we need to get that message out there that this is radioactive. This is not a canister that we want to open again because it unleashes unbelievable suffering. If you care for the poor, communism is what you want to run away from because it unleashes hell on the lower classes.
Yeah, when you put it like that, it's crazy that in modern times that we see any popular, like, because how popular is it right now?
So there have been a couple of polls, and usually what the polls do is they'll mix in communism with socialism, which there is a difference, but usually socialism it's always leading you in the direction. It's an on-ramp toward communism. But there was an article in 2019 published in The Independent in the UK about Americans, and it says more than a third of millennials approve of communism. So we're north of a third of the millennial generation that approves of communism. In 2017, there was a study done by the Fraser Institute, and this one found that more millennials prefer to live in a, quote, socialist, communist, or fascist nation than a capitalist one. Wow. In 2018, Gallup found that more millennials preferred socialism to capitalism. That's terrifying to me. The Economist magazine even ran a headline that was called The Rise in Socialism. And a 2019 Axios poll found that 61% of younger Gen Z adults have a positive view of socialism. So when they're asked like, hey, do you think that the government should begin taking roles and regulating or owning businesses or controlling things, more and more people are like, hey, that sounds like a good idea. We should empower the powerful with more power to help the exploited and the weak and the poor. And it's like learn from history. This doesn't work. It ends badly. It really does every time that you go in that direction. It doesn't end well.
And the trouble is, like, I'm a millennial. It turns out I just wasn't taught all of those numbers. I wasn't taught about Lenin or Stalin and what they did. It took me until I was 30 and I listened to a Real Dictators podcast to figure out what any of these guys even did. And all of a sudden you see how all that progresses every single time. You're like, wait, that's not what I was sold.
Yeah.
Like,
so in that podcast series, Real Dictators, which you've listened to, right?
Yeah.
Isn't it predictable? Like every time the story is like
same one.
It's the same story again and again. As you have a guy who comes along and what's his selling scheme? He comes along and says, I'll help you.
Yeah.
I'm going to bring us out of the ashes.
These are the bad guys. I can help you get what you want.
That's right. And how does the story go? Give me the playbook.
I mean, he comes to power. all of a sudden a bunch of people die. Like you said, like even
Every time.
even Karl Marx, like, hey, it's gonna be bad for a while.
Mm-hmm.
And all of a sudden, everybody who has a voice to stop this is dead. And all of a sudden, people are looking around. Now this guy has absolute power. We can't stop him now. He gets too big. And then eventually war happens, and then everything crumbles.
And what's weird is the wealth doesn't go to the poor. The wealth goes to all of his friends.
Yeah.
Now all of a sudden there's just oligarchs around the communist leader and everybody else is starving. Like, look at everywhere. I mean, even in modern headlines, look at what's happened to Venezuela. That's gone from being one of the wealthiest nations in the Western Hemisphere. Once they embraced radical socialism, look at what's happened to them under Hugo Chavez and Maduro. You've got massive oppression, massive starvation. Their nation has fallen into shambles. Look at what happened to Cuba. In the 1950s, goes from one of the wealthiest nations that was a tourist spot for everybody. Everybody wanted to go there. Look at what it is now. Look at what's happened to religious freedom in these countries. Like, who would say, yes, let's import that into America? It's a great idea. It does not help the poor. And by the way, this isn't speculative anymore. So listen to this. In 1991, when the Soviet Union and the United States were raging in a Cold War, right? And it was the free West, the capitalist West, up against the Soviet Union, which was the birthplace of communism and the one who was exporting this all over the world. Well, the Soviet Union broke in 1991. And all of a sudden, a flurry of nations start abandoning communism to adopt free market principles. The Soviet Union starts breaking off all of its satellite countries. And listen to what happens. So as soon as these countries walk away from communism, and by the way, you know that huge list that I read earlier? Mm-hmm. How many communist countries are there today? 5. Just 5. There's only 5 left. Everyone else has walked away from it. And even China, which is one of those countries, is beginning to embrace free market stuff because they recognize communism as a train wreck. So listen to this. Between 1990 and 2011, all these nations walk away from communism. Oh, the poor must have suffered. They got rid of communism. The poor must be really hurting in those countries. Listen to this. The global poverty rate in the 2 decades after communism was abandoned fell from 43% to 21%.
Wow.
So the poverty rate when you get rid of communism falls by more than half. So who cares for the poor? Capitalism has done more to elevate the poor than any communism or socialism that has ever been tried. 1 billion people came out of poverty when the world abandoned communism.
That's different, yeah.
That's amazing. In 1960, communist China, this is hard, this is crazy to think about. Communist China was poorer than most African nations at the time.
Wow.
Now they're considered a dominant superpower. Now that they're gaining all the economic freedoms and they're beginning to build businesses and everything else, not the same story. They were poorer than most African nations, but after economic reforms that came after the collapse of Soviet Union, where they said, hey, we want to allow freedom in our markets, and we decollectivized farming, like we're going to allow businesses to own farmland again, and entrepreneurship and businesses and things like that, they'll start allowing. Chinese citizens enjoyed a 13-fold increase in their real income between 1990 and 2014. Wow. So in 24 years, their average income multiplied 13 times. 24 years, imagine your income multiplying.
I'm in.
Why? Why did it do that? Because they abandoned the stupid principles of communism. And what little bit of daylight of free markets they allowed into their country, their nation exploded in it. It brought the poor, radically lifted the poor. And nothing in history has done more to elevate people out of poverty than abandoning the ideals of communism. Free markets elevate the poor. And so this is another study that I think is just like, what do you do with this? If you're pro-communism, right? And
how do you respond?
You care about the poor. Listen to this. There's a study done by the Foundation for Economic Education, and they studied, all the different countries based on economic freedoms. Like, are you a free market country or are you a planned economy, centralized planning, communist? And they found that the income earned by the poorest 10% in the most economically free countries. So let's list the capitalist one. Let's take the bottom 10% of the capitalist countries, okay? And then we'll compare them to the least economically free countries. What would be the difference? The poorest of the capitalist countries, bottom 10%, earn 8 times more than those living in the least economically free countries. So 8 times more.
That's a huge number.
Huge number. I mean, so imagine 8 times more than you make just based on what kind of economy.
That's 80,000 versus 10,000.
Correct.
That's a huge number.
Correct. So when you're talking about like, and I understand it, like the idealized version of communism, oh, we'll all share and it'll be wonderful. And we'll go and just la, 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 la. Humanity doesn't allow that. And so what happens is when you give somebody the incentive to go out and make money for their family and to care for their own and to make their own stuff, turns out they care a lot more about it. Whereas when you collectivize it, it's like everybody goes, why
Whatever,
innovate? Why bother? I'm going to get the same no matter what I do. And so it's like everybody just sinks together because there's no incentive to create and to sell. And I'm making goods that you don't want, but I don't care because I'm getting the same check anyway. Turns out that when you innovate and when your efforts actually contribute to how you and your family are going to live, you make better goods. You make better decisions. You work harder to benefit your neighbors and your society, and you innovate and you bring technology that helps your people live in better medical care. By the way, you look at medical care, just to bring this up, medical care differences, just as an aside, like in those years where half of the world lost their mind and embraced communism and the world became a really dark place in the 20th century, in all the nations where you saw communism as a whole, guess what happened to life expectancy? Even as technology throughout the world was growing and growing and medical care and everything else was improving, life expectancy in those countries did this, while life expectancy in the capitalist countries did this. In the West, it was climbing. Infant mortality went down. Not in the communist countries. In all of these places, like every measurable outcome of prosperity, of health, of general happiness, plummeted. Liberty, gone. Like everything about communism is just dumb. I mean, it breeds destruction and really yucky times. So for anybody who thinks that communism is this really appealing, we'll just all get along and share, it never works out that way, and it always decimates the very people that it's promising to help the most.
And the crazy part about communism is it promises life, but it only brings death in all facets of life, like real physical death or a death of livelihoods or whatever it is. It just offers a promise that it can't fulfill because it's impossible. And even kind of in a funny way, not to make this less serious than it is, but if you look at the 5 countries that are practicing communists right now, would you want to live in them? Like North Korea?
No, thanks.
No. Laos? Never heard of it, but never want to go there. Cuba. I know a lot of Cubans in South Florida. They're not going back, even if you want to. Right? Vietnam. North Vietnam. Don't want to go there. China? Maybe if you're part of the ruling party, but if you're just have any religious beliefs or you have any feeling that's against that party, you don't want to live there. So it's like, take your chances, guys.
If you're an evangelical in China, there's a healthy chance you could disappear. Or if you're a Uyghur or a religious minority, you're going to end up in a train going to a camp somewhere. And the Chinese are like, we're not losing sleep over this. And that's the reality, man. Like there was a brilliant guy who was a survivor of a Soviet gulag. His name's Alexander Solzhenitsyn. He gave an address to Harvard, very famous. And after he got out of the gulags, where he was sent for just having common sense, he wrote this series of books called the Gulag Archipelago. And it was about all the different gulags that the Russians had established where they just sent dissidents. Like, if you disagree with us, you lose your freedom and we send you to the gulag to work in hard labor camps. And he went and collected stories and wrote the Gulag Archipelago, which is a really, really interesting read for anybody who wants to know how communism takes root and what it looks like when it's starting in the initial stages of taking everyone's liberty away. And he talks about the suffering of the people under communism. But I love this quote that he gives because it's really simple. And at the root of communism, like I said, Marx says communism begins where atheism begins. And Solzhenitsyn basically says, that's exactly right. Listen to what he says, and we'll close with this. He says, over a half a century ago, while I was still a child, I recall a number of old people offering the following explanation for the great disasters that had befallen Russia. Men have forgotten God. That's why all this has happened. Well, since then, I've spent 50 years working on the history of our revolution. In the process, I've read hundreds of books, collected hundreds of personal testimonies, and have already contributed 8 volumes of my own toward the effort of clearing away the rubble left by the upheaval. But if I were asked today to formulate as concisely as possible the main cause of the ruinous revolution that swallowed up some 60 million of our own people, I could not put it more accurately than to repeat, men have forgotten God. That's why all this has happened.
Powerful.
that's what happens. What is communism but to say, I mean, in a weird way, it's saying materialism is more important than men. Ironically, because it's supposed to be the antidote to that, right?
Yeah.
It's supposed to be like, oh no, men are more precious than their income. But inevitably what it says is it's envy. It's, hey, look what they have. We need to take it from them and give over here. And then it reduces men to just widgets that are treated with no care, to where 60 million, and how many in the gulags, and how many that starved, and all the suffering that it unleashes, all for the sake of a revolution and power that's centralized at the top so they can abuse it. It never has a different outcome. And so I love the fact that right now there's a trend in America all over the place where states are saying, we are going to bring this in and codify it to where this needs to be taught to the coming generations, because there should not be generations coming out of America that say, communism sounds like a good idea. No, it is a philosophy of death. It is hostile to the scriptures, and no Christian should be flirting with this ideology. It's devastating.
Don't become a commie.
That's correct. And so we'll leave it there. I want to thank you so much for watching. Join us next time as we take a look at another issue and examine what the Bible has to say about it here on In God We Trust.